I thought finding another person would make things easier. Someone who knew the routes, who'd survived longer than me, who could watch my back while I slept. Took me 3 weeks to realize he wasn't keeping me safe. He was keeping me alive for a reason. And by the time I understood what that reason was, I was already 40 miles from anywhere, with no water and no way back. I found him 3 days after the water ran out. He was sitting on the remains of a highway overpass, legs dangling over the edge, cleaning a rifle with a rag that had once been white. The sun was setting behind him, turning the dust in the air the color of old blood. I'd been walking for 6 hours without shade, and the sight of another person made something in my chest constrict in a way I hadn't felt in months. Not quite hope, something more desperate than that. He turned before I called out. People who survive learn to notice when they're being watched. You armed? His voice carried across the gap between us, casual, like he was asking about the weather. I held up my hands, showing the empty holster on my hip. The revolver had jammed 2 weeks back, and I'd traded it for a can of peaches that had already been opened. Stupid, but I'd been hungry enough not to care. He nodded, stood, and gestured for me to come closer. When I got near enough to see his face properly, I noticed the scar tissue along his jaw, old burns, maybe chemical. His eyes were pale in a way that made them hard to read, like looking at fog. "Where you headed?" he asked. "Anywhere that has water. That's not a direction. It's the only one I've got." He smiled at that, though it didn't reach his eyes. "There's a settlement. About 40 miles north. They've got a well. Not clean, but you can filter it if you're careful. 40 miles. I had maybe 1 day left in me, probably less. He seemed to understand this from the way I sagged. "I'm going that way," he said. "You can walk with me if you want, safer with 2. I should have asked him questions. Where he'd come from, what he was doing out here alone, why he was willing to let a stranger tag along. But the idea of having someone else to watch the horizon while I slept, it made me agree, before the doubts could form words. His name was Garrett. He didn't ask for mine, and I didn't offer it. We walked as the light failed, and he set a pace that was just sustainable enough that I could keep up if I focused on nothing else. He didn't talk much. When he did, it was practical. Where to step, what sounds to listen for. He pointed out the bones of a Brahmin half buried in sand and told me the meat had probably been scavenged months ago, but sometimes the marrow was still good if you cracked the bones right. We made camp in the shell of a gas station. The roof was mostly gone, but 3 walls still stood, and that was enough to cut the wind. Garrett built a small fire using old tire rubber and some kind of accelerant he kept in a flask. The smell was acrid, but the heat felt like a gift. I offered to take first watch. He shook his head. "You need sleep more than I do. I'll wake you in a few hours." I wanted to argue, to prove I could carry my weight, but my body betrayed me. I was asleep before the fire burned down to coals. When I woke, the sun was already up. Garrett was sitting against the wall, eating something from a can. He saw me stir and tossed me a similar container beans, the label mostly scraped off but still legible enough to date it pre-war. I ate without asking where he'd gotten it. People who survive learn not to interrogate good fortune. We walked for another day and a half. Garrett knew the land in a way that suggested he'd crossed it many times. He steered us around certain areas without explaining why, and I followed because I didn't have a better option. Once, we passed a cluster of buildings that looked intact enough to be worth searching, but Garrett didn't even glance at them. "Not worth it," he said when I hesitated. "How do you know?" "Because I checked them already." That should have been the first warning. Not the fact that he'd been here before, but the way he said it like he'd expected me to ask. On the 3rd day, we saw smoke in the distance. Garrett stopped, shaded his eyes, and watched it for a long time. "Cooking fire," he said finally, "or a signal. Should we check it out?" "No." He started walking again, angling us away from the smoke. I followed, but I kept looking back. Whoever had made that fire was close enough that we could have reached them by nightfall. But Garrett's pace never changed, and I didn't push the issue. That night, he shared his water. A small sip from a canteen that looked military issue, the kind with a filter built into the cap. I drank carefully, trying not to take more than my share, and handed it back. "You're doing better," he said, "than when I found you." It was true. My head felt clearer. My hands had stopped shaking. But something about the observation made me uneasy, though I couldn't name why. "You do this often?" I asked. "Help people?" He looked at me for a moment, then back at the fire. "When it makes sense." "What makes it make sense?" "Direction, mutual benefit, the usual." The usual. As if there was anything usual about any of this. We reached the settlement on the 5th day. It wasn't much, a dozen structures built from scrap metal and concrete, surrounded by a fence made of chain link and barbed wire. There were people, though. I could see them moving between the buildings, and the sight of them made something in me relax that I hadn't realized was tense. Garrett stopped at the edge of the fence and called out. A man appeared on the other side, older, with a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. He looked at Garrett, then at me, and his expression didn't change. "Garrett, Marcus, didn't expect you back so soon. Found someone who needed a hand." Marcus studied me with the kind of assessment that comes from experience. I could feel him weighing what I might cost against what I might contribute. After a moment, he nodded and opened the gate. Inside, the settlement felt more organized than I'd expected. There was a well in the center, just as Garrett had said, and people moved with purpose rather than panic. A woman was hanging laundry on a line strung between two buildings. A child, maybe 8 or 9, was carrying a bucket that looked too heavy for him. Marcus led us to a building that served as a communal space, sleeping mats on the floor, a few crates serving as tables. He pointed to an empty corner. "You can stay there. We'll talk terms tomorrow." I thanked him, but he'd already turned away. Garrett set his pack down in a different corner, further from the door, and started unpacking with the ease of someone who'd done this before. I should have asked him then how many times he'd been here, how he knew Marcus, why Marcus hadn't seemed surprised to see me. But exhaustion was pulling at me again, and the idea of sleeping somewhere with walls, even walls made of sheet metal, made those questions feel less urgent. The settlement had rules. Marcus explained them the next morning. Everyone worked, no exceptions, no stealing, no violence within the fence. Break the rules, and you were out. Simple, direct, survivable. I was assigned to water duty, filtering and rationing, making sure everyone got their share and no one took more. It was tedious work, but it was work I could do without thinking, which suited me. Garrett was assigned to scavenging runs. He left early most mornings with 1 or 2 others and came back before dark with whatever they'd found. I didn't see him much after that first week. When I did, he was always busy, always moving. But I noticed things. The way people deferred to him, even though Marcus was clearly in charge. The way he always seemed to know when supplies were running low before anyone else did. The way his corner of the sleeping quarters slowly accumulated more than anyone else's. It was the woman with the laundry who first made me question it. Her name was Iris, and she'd been at the settlement longer than most. We were filtering water together one afternoon when she asked how I'd arrived. I told her about Garrett finding me, about the walk north. She nodded slowly, her hands never stopping their work. "He's good at that." "At what?" "Finding people who need help." There was something in the way she said it that made me pause. "Is that a problem?" She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was careful. "Just make sure you're useful. Long as you're useful, you'll be fine." I wanted to ask her what happened when you stopped being useful, but Marcus called her away before I could. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the smoke we'd seen on the way here, about the buildings Garrett had steered us away from, about the way he'd known exactly where to find the settlement, exactly how long it would take to get here, exactly what to say to Marcus to get me through the gate. I'd assumed he was helping me. But what if I'd been helping him? The thought sat in my chest like a stone. I started paying attention. Not obviously people who survive learn to watch without being seen, but I noticed patterns. Garrett never took the same scavenging partner twice in a row. He always volunteered for runs that went east, never west. When supplies came back, they were distributed evenly, but Garrett always handled the inventory first, always counted, always checked. And people kept arriving. Every few weeks, someone new would show up at the gate, brought by Garrett, always alone, always desperate, always exactly useful enough to justify feeding. I asked Iris about it one night when we were alone. Where do they come from? Where do any of us come from? No, I mean, does Garrett go looking for them? She was quiet for a long time. Then, you should ask him. But I didn't. Because I was starting to understand that asking questions was how you made yourself less useful. The pattern broke when a man named Cole arrived. Garrett brought him in on a Tuesday, and unlike the others, Cole wasn't desperate. He was careful, controlled. He had his own gear, his own supplies, and he watched everything with the kind of attention that suggested he was used to being the one doing the recruiting. Marcus didn't like him. I could see it in the way he assigned Cole to perimeter duty necessary work, but isolated, away from the center of the settlement. Cole didn't seem to care. He did his shifts, kept to himself, and watched. Especially Garrett. I was filtering water when Cole approached me. It was late afternoon, and most people were either working or resting before dinner. He sat down on a crate nearby, close enough to talk but not close enough to be obvious about it. "You came in with Garrett," he said. "I did. How long were you out there?" "Before he found you." "A while. You know where you were when he found you?" I described the highway overpass, the gas station where we'd camped, the direction we'd traveled. Cole nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something. "You ever wonder why he was out there?" "Looking for supplies," I assumed. "Maybe." He picked at something on his boot. "Or maybe he was looking for you." The water I was filtering suddenly felt very cold. "What does that mean?" "Means Garrett's good at finding people, real good, almost like he knows where to look." I wanted to dismiss it, to tell Cole he was paranoid, seeing patterns where there were none. But I kept thinking about the route Garrett had taken, about the buildings he'd avoided, about the smoke in the distance that he'd steered us away from. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Cole looked at me directly for the first time. His eyes were dark, sharp. "Because I've seen this before. Different place, different setup, same pattern. People come in useful, they stay useful, and then one day they're not useful anymore, and they're gone." "Gone where?" "That's the question, isn't it?" He stood and walked away before I could respond. That night, I lay awake and tried to remember the other people Garrett had brought in. There had been 5 since I'd arrived. I could picture their faces, remember their names, but when I tried to think of where they were now, I couldn't. Some had been reassigned to different tasks. Some had left for other settlements, or so I'd been told, but I couldn't remember actually seeing any of them leave. Couldn't remember goodbyes or explanations. They'd simply stopped being present, and I'd stopped noticing. The realization made my skin feel too tight. I started watching Garrett more carefully. Not just his movements, but the gaps around them. The times he left the settlement alone. The supplies that came back without explanation. The way people would be there one day and gone the next, and no one seemed to question it. And I noticed something else. The people who stayed, the ones like Iris and Marcus who'd been here the longest, they all had one thing in common. They were essential. Water management, perimeter security, food preparation. Remove any one of them, and the settlement would struggle. The rest of us were interchangeable. Cole disappeared 3 days after our conversation. Marcus announced it at breakfast, said he'd left for another settlement, one that needed someone with his skills. But his gear was still in the sleeping quarters. His rations were still unclaimed. I caught Garrett's eye across the room, and for just a moment I saw something there. Not guilt, exactly. Recognition. Like he'd noticed me noticing. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against the wall, my jammed revolver in my lap even though it was useless, and I waited. Garrett didn't come, but the next morning, Marcus pulled me aside. "Need you to go on a supply run with Garrett, east, toward the old industrial zone." I thought I was on water duty. "Iris can cover it. Garrett needs someone who knows how to spot clean containers." I'd never mentioned that I knew how to do that, had never been assigned to scavenging, but Marcus was already walking away, and Garrett was waiting by the gate with 2 packs and that same pale, unreadable expression. We left at dawn. Garrett set the same pace he had when I'd first met him, just sustainable enough, just quiet enough. We didn't talk for the first hour. The silence felt different now, though. Heavier. Like we were both waiting for something to shift. The industrial zone was exactly what it sounded like: collapsed factories, rusted machinery, buildings that had been picked clean decades ago. Garrett led us through the ruins with the same certainty he'd shown on our first walk, and I followed because turning back alone seemed more dangerous than continuing forward. We stopped at a building that had once been a warehouse. The walls were still standing, but the roof had caved in, leaving the interior exposed to the sky. Garrett circled the perimeter once, then gestured for me to follow him inside. "There's a basement level," he said. "Storage. Might still have sealed containers. You've been here before." "I've been everywhere before." He found the stairs leading down, tested them, and started descending. I followed, and with each step, the light from above grew dimmer until I was moving through near darkness, guided only by the sound of Garrett's footsteps ahead. The basement was larger than I'd expected. Metal shelving units lined the walls, most of them empty, some collapsed. Garrett pulled out a flashlight and started checking the corners, methodical, practiced. I stayed near the stairs. "You going to help or just watch?" he asked without turning around. "Why did Marcus send me?" "Because you know containers." I never told him that. Garrett paused, then continued searching. "You must have." "I didn't." He straightened, turned to face me. In the flashlight beam, his eyes looked even paler, almost colorless. "Does it matter?" "It does if you told him." "And why would I do that?" "Because you wanted me here, alone, away from the settlement." He studied me for a long moment, and I wondered if he'd deny it, if he'd laugh and tell me I was being paranoid. But he didn't. "You're not stupid," he said finally. "I should have realized that sooner." My hand moved to the useless revolver at my hip, and Garrett noticed. He didn't reach for his rifle. "Didn't need to." "That won't help you," he said. "And even if it worked, you'd still be 40 miles from anything, with no water and no sense of direction. So what happens now? Now you make a choice. You can go back to the settlement and keep filtering water and pretending you don't see the patterns. Or you can keep asking questions and find out what happened to Cole. You killed him." "I didn't have to." "He made himself a problem, and problems solve themselves out here. I just facilitate." The word hung in the air between us, clinical and cold. "The others too?" I asked. "The ones you brought in? The ones who stopped being useful? The ones who got curious? The ones who thought they could leave and tell people what they'd figured out?" He tilted his head slightly, almost curious. "You think settlements like Marcus's survive on cooperation alone? Someone has to make the hard calls. Someone has to manage the variables." "That's me. That's what I do." "And Marcus knows. Marcus knows what he needs to know. That I bring in people, that the settlement stays stable, that problems disappear before they become threats." He paused. "He doesn't ask questions. Neither should you." I thought about running, about trying to make it back to the settlement, to tell Iris, to tell anyone. But Garrett was right. I had no water, no weapons that worked. And even if I made it back, who would believe me? Who would risk the stability of the settlement on the word of someone who'd only been there a few weeks? "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you're useful, smart, observant, good at details." and because I think you're practical enough to understand that survival isn't about morality. It's about cost management." He took a step closer. "You can keep being useful, go back, do your work, stop noticing things, or you can become a variable I have to manage. Your choice." The flashlight beam made harsh shadows on his face, and I understood then what I'd really been seeing all along. Not cruelty, not even malice, just efficiency. A system that had learned to perpetuate itself by removing anything that threatened its balance. And I was being offered a place in that system. I thought about Cole, about the others whose names I could barely remember, about the smoke in the distance that Garrett had steered us away from maybe another settlement, maybe people who could have helped, maybe just ash. I thought about Iris and her careful warnings, about Marcus and his deliberate blindness, about the cost of staying alive. "I'll go back," I said. "I'll keep filtering water." Garrett nodded, unsurprised, smart. We found 3 sealed containers in the basement, exactly as Garrett had predicted. We carried them back to the settlement as the sun set, and no one asked why the trip had taken so long. Marcus logged the containers, Iris helped me clean them, and life continued with the same rhythmic efficiency it had before. I stopped asking questions, stopped noticing when people disappeared, stopped watching Garrett except when he watched me, which was often enough to keep me careful but not often enough to be threatening. And I kept filtering water, because that's what you do when you understand the cost of survival. You find your place in the system, you make yourself necessary, you look away from the things that would make you a problem. You become complicit, quietly, one choice at a time. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. The settlement took on a rhythm that felt almost normal, if you didn't think too hard about the spaces where people used to be. I learned the rotation of who worked when, who spoke to whom, who avoided eye contact when certain topics came up. Iris never mentioned Cole, neither did anyone else. His name simply stopped being said, like a word that had fallen out of use. Garrett brought in another person at the end of the month. A woman this time, maybe 30, with sunburned skin and clothes that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. She had a cough that sounded wet, and Marcus assigned her to sorting duties, light work, indoor, nothing that would strain her lungs. Her name was Lynn. She was grateful in a way that hurt to watch, thanking everyone for small kindnesses, offering to help even when she could barely stand. I showed her how the water filtration worked, how to recognize when a filter was too clogged to be effective, how to conserve soap when cleaning containers. She reminded me of myself when I'd first arrived. That same desperation wrapped in forced competence. That same need to prove she deserved the space she was taking up. I tried not to think about how long she'd last. Garrett left on longer runs after that, sometimes 3 days, sometimes 5. He always came back with supplies, not much, but enough to justify the absence. Canned food with labels too faded to read. Scrap metal that could be repurposed. Once, a working radio that Marcus immediately claimed for perimeter communication. But I started noticing the weight of his pack when he left versus when he returned. The way he'd disappear into his corner for hours after coming back, organizing things I never saw him use. The maps he kept folded in his jacket pocket, marked with symbols I didn't recognize. Lynn's cough got worse. Marcus moved her to a corner further from the communal sleeping area, said it was to keep from disturbing anyone's rest. She apologized when I brought her water rations, said she'd be better soon, said she just needed time to recover. I told her not to worry about it, that everyone got sick out here, that the settlement had weathered worse. I don't know if she believed me. A week later, Lynn was gone. Marcus made the announcement during morning assignments, said her condition had deteriorated, that she'd left to find medical supplies at an old hospital 2 days east, said she'd understood the risk but wanted to try. Her blanket was still folded in the corner where she'd slept. Her water cup still sat beside it, unwashed. No one asked to see the body. No one suggested sending someone after her. The announcement was met with the same muted acceptance as all the others, and within an hour, work had resumed as if she'd never been there at all. I found Garrett sharpening a knife near the perimeter fence that afternoon. He didn't look up when I approached. Lynn didn't leave, did she? He tested the blade against his thumb, wiped it clean, kept working. Does it matter? She was sick. She wasn't a problem. She was dying, slow, loud, taking up resources we couldn't spare. He finally looked at me. You want me to lie and tell you I gave her a chance? That I sent her off with supplies and hope? Would that make you feel better? I want to know what happens to the people who can't keep up. You already know. You've known since Cole. You've known since you stopped asking questions. He went back to sharpening. The difference is now you're deciding whether you're okay with it. I should have felt anger, disgust, something sharp and clean that would tell me I was still capable of moral outrage. But all I felt was tired. How many? I asked. Does the number matter? Yes. He considered that, then shrugged. 11 in the last 2 years. 12 if you count the one who tried to run and didn't make it past the first night. 12 people. 12 bodies buried somewhere in the wasteland, or left for scavengers, or burned, or simply abandoned. 12 variables managed. Why are you telling me this? Because you asked. Because you're already complicit, whether you admit it or not. You filter the water that I make sure stays rationed. You sleep in a settlement that I keep stable. You benefit from every hard choice I make, and you know it. He held up the knife, examined the edge in the fading light. The only question is whether you're going to pretend you don't. I walked away without responding, went back to my corner, sat with my back against the wall, and tried to remember what it had felt like to believe cooperation still mattered. That people could build something without becoming the very thing that destroyed everything else. But the memory wouldn't come. That night, I dreamed about the highway overpass where I'd met Garrett. In the dream, I walked past him without stopping, kept going north on my own, even though I had no water and no plan. In the dream, I died 2 days later, alone, but at least I died without knowing what I'd become. I woke up before dawn and couldn't fall back asleep. Marcus called a meeting 3 days later. Everyone gathered in the communal space, standing in loose clusters, waiting. He looked older than I remembered, his face lined in ways that suggested he'd stopped sleeping well. We've had reports, he said, raiders, moving east to west along the old interstate. They hit a settlement about 70 miles south last week, took everything, left no one alive. The room went silent. Raiders weren't uncommon, but organized ones, the kind that moved with purpose and left nothing behind. Those were different. Those were the kind that ended settlements. We're too small to fight them off if they come here, Marcus continued. Too visible to hide. So we're going to relocate. There's a vault about 100 miles northwest. Sealed, but Garrett knows a way in. We leave in 2 days. Pack light. Take only what you can carry. People started talking at once, but Marcus raised his hand and they quieted. This isn't optional. Anyone who stays behind stays alone. The settlement moves as one, or it doesn't move at all. After the meeting dispersed, I found Iris packing her few belongings into a canvas sack. She worked with the kind of methodical calm that suggested she'd done this before. You believe him? I asked. About the raiders? Does it matter whether I believe him? It does if he's lying. She paused, looked at me. Marcus doesn't lie. He just chooses what truths to share. And if the truth is there are no raiders, that this is about something else, then we pack up and move anyway, because Marcus says so, and Marcus keeps us alive. She tied off the sack, tested the weight. You think too much about the why. Out here, the why doesn't matter. Only the what. I wanted to argue with her, to point out that the why was everything, that understanding the system was the only way to resist it. But Iris had already moved on, already accepted whatever was coming, and I realized she'd made her peace with it long before I'd arrived. I spent the next day sorting through my possessions. It didn't take long, a few changes of clothes, a water filtration kit, The jammed revolver I still carried for reasons I couldn't articulate. Everything fit into a single pack with room to spare. Garrett found me that evening. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching me organize. "You ready?" he asked. "For what?" "The vault. The move. Whatever comes next." "Are there really raiders?" "There are always raiders. Whether they're 70 miles south or 700 doesn't change what we need to do, which is survive, same as always." I looked at him, really looked, and saw the weight of what he carried. Not guilt, he'd long since abandoned that luxury, but awareness, a clear-eyed understanding of exactly what he was and what he'd chosen to become. And I wondered if I looked the same to him now. "The vault," I said. "How do you know about it?" "Because I've been there before. Used to run supplies between there and here, back when both places were operating." "Used to?" "The vault sealed up about a year ago. Internal conflict, from what I heard. But the seal mechanism is external. We can get in if we need to." "And the people inside?" He smiled, and it was the most honest expression I'd seen from him. "That depends on whether they're still alive, and whether they're willing to share." The march northwest began at dawn. 23 people, everything they owned on their backs, moving through terrain that alternated between cracked asphalt and open desert. Marcus set the pace, with Garrett ranging ahead to scout. I walked somewhere in the middle, next to Iris, who moved with the steady endurance of someone who'd learned not to waste energy on worry. The first day passed without incident. We camped in the ruins of a shopping center, sleeping in what had once been a department store. The mannequins were still standing in the windows, their plastic faces watching us with blank indifference. The second day, we saw smoke on the horizon. Garrett circled back to confer with Marcus, and they decided to detour south to avoid whatever was burning. It added 6 miles to the journey, but no one complained. Out here, caution was cheaper than regret. On the third day, we found the bodies. They were lying in the road, 3 of them, maybe a week dead. The sun and scavengers had done their work, but enough remained to tell the story. Gunshot wounds, empty pockets, the kind of casual violence that happened when someone had something others wanted. Marcus ordered us to keep moving. No one argued. We stepped around the bodies like they were potholes, just another obstacle in the landscape. But I noticed Garrett studying them, not with horror or pity, but with the clinical interest of someone assessing data. He crouched beside one, checked the pockets that had already been checked, examined the wounds, stood, and moved on. When I caught up to him later, I asked what he'd been looking for. "Confirmation," he said. "Of what?" "That they died the way they appeared to die." "Why would they have died any other way?" "Because sometimes people stage scenes, make something look like banditry when it's really execution. Make you think you're walking into one kind of danger when you're actually walking into another." "And were these staged?" "No, these were real, which is worse in some ways." "Why?" "Because it means we're in territory where casual violence is common enough that no one bothers to hide it." The vault appeared on the horizon on the 5th day. It looked like a concrete bunker half buried in a hillside, the kind of structure designed to outlast whatever apocalypse came for it. The entrance was a massive circular door, sealed tight, with a control panel beside it that had long since gone dark. Garrett approached it with Marcus, while the rest of us waited at a distance. They worked at the panel for nearly an hour, and I watched as Garrett produced tools I'd never seen him carry, manipulating mechanisms I didn't understand. Finally, something clicked. The door shuddered, then began to roll open with a sound like grinding stone. The air that escaped was stale and cold, carrying the smell of recycled atmosphere and something else underneath it, something organic and wrong. Marcus peered into the darkness, then looked back at Garrett. "How long since you were here last?" 18 months, maybe 20. "And it was operational then?" "It was sealed, same as now." "Then why does it smell like decay?" Garrett didn't answer. He pulled out his flashlight and stepped through the entrance, disappearing into the dark. Marcus followed, and after a moment, so did I. The vault was exactly what I'd expected from the stories. Concrete corridors lined with doors, emergency lighting that flickered weakly from backup generators, signs pointing toward facilities that promised safety and civilization, and all the comforts of pre-war life. But the smell was getting stronger. We found them in the common area, 40, maybe 50 people, all dead, some slumped in chairs, others on the floor, no visible wounds, no signs of violence, just bodies in various states of decomposition, arranged as if they'd simply stopped mid-activity and never started again. Marcus backed toward the entrance, his hand over his mouth. Garrett moved through the room systematically, checking terminals, examining supply crates, looking for answers. I stood in the doorway and tried to make sense of the scene. The people were dressed in vault suits, clean and maintained. The common area showed no signs of struggle. Food containers sat on tables, some still partially full. Whatever had killed them, it had been quick enough that they hadn't had time to react, or slow enough that they'd accepted it. "Oxygen recyclers," Garrett called from across the room. He was crouched beside a panel, reading data from a terminal that had somehow maintained power. They failed gradually over the course of a week. Oxygen levels dropped slowly enough that people didn't notice until it was too late. They would have just gotten drowsy, then confused, then unconscious. "Can we fix it?" Marcus asked. Garrett was quiet for a long moment, reading. Then, "The system's completely dead. We could maybe scavenge parts, but rebuilding from scratch would take weeks, maybe months." "What about the rest of the vault? Sleeping quarters, storage, water?" "Intact, sealed off from the common area. The oxygen failure was localized to the public spaces. Individual rooms still have independent air supplies." Marcus looked at the bodies, then at Garrett, then back at the entrance where the others waited. I could see him calculating, 50 corpses against 23 living people. A facility that could house hundreds reduced to a tomb, now being considered as shelter. "We clear the bodies," Marcus said finally. "Strip what we can use. Seal off the affected areas. The rest of the vault is usable." "The bodies," I said. "We're just going to." "We're going to survive," Marcus cut me off. "We're going to take this facility and make it work. Those people don't need it anymore. We do." Garrett was already moving, dragging the first body toward the entrance. Marcus joined him. After a moment, others from the group filtered in, saw what needed to be done, and began helping. I stood there watching them work, watching people who'd been strangers weeks ago now methodically disposing of corpses so they could claim the space left behind. No ceremony, no words, just efficiency driven by necessity. Iris appeared beside me. She didn't say anything, just handed me a pair of work gloves and walked toward the nearest body. I put on the gloves. I picked up my share of the dead. I carried them out into the wasteland and helped pile them in a shallow depression half a mile from the vault entrance. We burned them that night, and the smoke rose black against the stars. The vault became home. We sectioned off the areas that still had working air recyclers, claimed quarters in the living sections, established new routines in the skeleton of someone else's failure. The beds still had sheets. The lockers still had personal effects. We sorted through the remnants of 50 lives, taking what was useful, discarding what wasn't. I found a diary in one of the rooms. A woman's handwriting, neat and precise, documenting the slow degradation of the oxygen system. The early entries were clinical, noting fluctuations and filing maintenance requests. The later entries became confused, sentences trailing off mid-thought, complaints about headaches and exhaustion. The last entry was a single line. "Everyone is sleeping, I should sleep too." I burned the diary with the bodies. Marcus established the same rules as before. Everyone worked. No stealing, no violence. The vault's existing infrastructure made things easier in some ways. Water recyclers that still functioned, power from a geothermal source that had outlasted its builders, storage rooms full of canned goods that would last years if rationed properly. But it also made things worse. Because now we weren't just surviving, we were inhabiting. living in the spaces where people had died, sleeping in their beds, eating from their stores, wearing their clothes when ours wore out. Becoming ghosts, replacing ghosts. Garrett disappeared for 3 days, then came back with supplies he said he'd scavenged from nearby ruins. But I'd seen the vault's inventory terminals. I'd seen how the numbers changed. I knew he was taking from our stores and cycling them through his scavenging runs to make it look like he was contributing more than he was. I didn't say anything. Neither did anyone else. The settlement, if you could call it that, fell into rhythm. People paired off, formed small social units, claimed territories within the vault's structure. Iris took over the water management, same as before. Marcus maintained order, same as before. And Garrett ranged out on his runs, same as before, always coming back with just enough to justify his position. I was assigned to inventory management, tracking supplies, logging consumption, projecting how long things would last. It was detailed work, quiet work, the kind that suited someone who'd learned to keep their head down and their observations private. 3 months passed. Then 6. The vault held, systems functioning within acceptable parameters, and life, if you could call it that, continued. But people started disappearing again. Not obviously, not all at once, but over time, faces became absent. First a man named David who'd been assigned to maintenance, then a woman named Sarah who'd been managing the medical supplies. Each time, Marcus had an explanation. David had wanted to try his luck on the surface, see if there were other settlements nearby. Sarah had taken a small team to search for additional medical equipment at a hospital 3 days east. Their belongings stayed behind, their rations stayed unclaimed, and gradually, imperceptibly, our numbers shrank. Iris stopped talking to me. When I tried to ask her about it, she'd simply move to a different task, put physical distance between us, like I carried a disease she didn't want to catch. I realized I did. The disease of noticing, of counting, of understanding that the pattern hadn't changed, only the location. I found Garrett in the security office one night, reviewing footage from the vault's internal cameras. Most of them were dead, but a few still functioned, showing grainy black and white views of empty corridors. "You're managing the population," I said. He didn't turn around. "I'm managing resources." People aren't resources. Everything's a resource. Food, water, space, labor. People consume all of those things. When consumption exceeds production, you adjust the equation. By killing them. By making hard choices that keep everyone else alive. He finally looked at me. "You think Marcus doesn't know? You think Iris hasn't figured it out? They know. They've always known. They just don't want to be the ones making the decision, so they let me carry it. And you're fine with that. I'm realistic about it. Someone has to be." He turned back to the monitors. "You want to know the real difference between me and them. I don't pretend I'm not doing it. I don't lie to myself about necessary evil or greater good. I just do what needs to be done and live with it." "How many more?" I asked. "How many more what? How many more people before the equation balances? Before you've managed the population down to sustainable levels?" He was quiet for a moment, calculating. "At current consumption rates? 4, maybe 5 if we stretch rations. And then? And then we're stable, for a while. Until something changes and we have to adjust again." I should have left then. Should have walked away and pretended I hadn't heard, but I'd crossed too many lines to pretend I had somewhere else to stand. "Who decides?" I asked. "Who's next?" "I do. Based on contribution versus consumption, it's not personal. It's math. And have you done the math on me?" He smiled. "You're useful. Good with numbers, detail-oriented, minimal resource consumption. You'll be one of the last, if it comes to that. If. Nothing's certain. Maybe we'll find another vault. Maybe a trader route will establish itself. Maybe the population will balance naturally through attrition." He shrugged. "Or maybe I'll have to make 4 more hard choices. Time will tell." I left him there, surrounded by dead monitors and the cold logic of survival math, and went back to my quarters. Sat on a bed that had belonged to someone else, in a room that had been claimed from the dead, in a vault that had become a tomb that became a settlement that was slowly becoming a tomb again. And I understood with perfect clarity that I'd stopped being a person somewhere along the way. I'd become a variable in an equation, a number in a balance sheet, a resource to be managed or eliminated based on utility. We all had. The only question was whether I was going to accept it or become one of the adjustments. I ran the numbers myself that night, checked the inventory logs, tracked consumption rates, projected timelines. Garrett was right. At current levels, we had maybe 8 months before rationing became critical. A year before people started dying of malnutrition. Unless the population decreased, 4 people, maybe 5. I made a list of who I thought would go, not based on who I liked or valued, but based purely on the math. Who consumed the most, who contributed the least, who would be easiest to claim had left without anyone questioning it too hard. The list matched almost perfectly with the people who'd already disappeared. I was becoming Garrett, running the same calculations, making the same assessments, accepting the same logic. The only difference was he'd been doing it longer, had stopped fighting the weight of it. I burned the list. 2 weeks later, Marcus called another meeting. The remaining 17 of us gathered in what had been the Vault's cafeteria, and I noticed how much smaller the group looked now, how the spaces between us had grown wider, how we'd stopped standing close enough to touch. "We've had a communication," Marcus said. "Radio signal from another settlement, about 200 miles west. They're establishing a trade network, offering to exchange supplies, share resources, create something bigger than isolated communities." People shifted, uncertain whether to be hopeful or suspicious. In a world where other people were usually a threat, the idea of cooperation felt like a trap. "Garrett's going to make contact," Marcus continued. "Establish whether they're legitimate. If they are, we'll consider joining their network. If not, we continue as we are." Garrett stood near the wall, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He met my eyes for just a moment, and I understood what Marcus hadn't said, that this wasn't about trade networks or cooperation. That Garrett was going to assess whether these people were a threat or an opportunity, whether they should be avoided, absorbed, or eliminated. And that whatever he decided would become our reality, presented as established fact by the time he returned. After the meeting, I found Marcus alone in the security office, staring at the few working monitors. "You're letting him make all the decisions," I said. "I'm letting him make the decisions I don't want to make." "That's the same thing." "No, it's not." He looked at me, and I saw the exhaustion there, the weight of leadership without the will to lead. "I keep people fed. I maintain order. I create the structure that lets people survive. But I don't have what it takes to make the hard calls, the ones that keep the structure standing when it should collapse. So you let Garrett do it. I let Garrett do what needs to be done, and I sleep a little better at night knowing I'm not the one doing it, even though I know that makes me a coward. It makes you complicit. We're all complicit. You, me, Iris, everyone who stayed. We've all made the choice to keep surviving, no matter what that costs." He turned back to the monitors. "You think you're different? You think you haven't made the same choice?" I left without answering, because we both knew he was right. Garrett left the next morning, taking a pack light enough to move fast and heavy enough to look prepared. He said he'd be gone a week, maybe 2. That he'd signal when he had information. That we should maintain rationing protocols and keep the vault secured. Marcus nodded. Iris nodded. I nodded. We'd all become very good at nodding. The first few days after Garrett left felt almost normal. Work continued. Meals were prepared. The vault systems cycled on their automated schedules, indifferent to the people living inside them. But on the 4th day, someone found the bodies. They were in one of the sealed sections, in a storage room we'd been told was contaminated and off-limits. The seal had degraded enough that the smell finally escaped, and when we forced the door open, we found them. David, Sarah, 3 others whose names I'd forgotten, arranged carefully on the floor, covered with vault-issue blankets, personal effects stacked beside them. Executed. Marcus sealed the room again immediately, ordered everyone back to their quarters, told us it was a contamination issue, that the bodies were from the original vault population, that we'd missed them in the initial clearing. But I'd seen David's jacket, the same one he'd been wearing the day he disappeared, and I'd seen the bullet holes in the wall behind where the bodies had been arranged. That night, people started talking. Whispered conversations in corners, theories that started careful and grew bolder. Some people wanted to leave. Others wanted to confront Marcus. A few suggested waiting for Garrett to return, as if he'd somehow make this make sense. Iris found me in the inventory room, where I'd been pretending to work. "You knew," she said. "It wasn't a question." I suspected. "And you didn't say anything." "What would I have said? What would you have done if I had?" She was quiet for a long time. "Probably nothing. Same as now. So why are you angry?" "Because I want to be angry at someone, and Garrett's not here, and Marcus won't admit what he's allowed to happen, and you're the only one who seems to understand what we've become." She sat down on a supply crate, suddenly looking much older than she had moments before. "I've been at this longer than you. Been through 3 settlements before this one. You want to know why I've survived? Because you're useful. Because I learned to stop caring about the why, to just do the work and trust that someone else was handling the hard parts. But I think I've run out of the ability to not care. I think seeing those bodies, it broke something that I'd been holding together for a long time." "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. Leave, probably. Try to make it on my own. I did it before. I can do it again. And if you can't, if you die out there, then at least I'll have died trying to be something other than this." She left that night, took her pack, her water filtration gear, and walked out through the vault entrance without saying goodbye to anyone else. I watched her go from one of the working monitors, and then I erased the footage so no one else would know which direction she'd headed. 3 more people left over the next 2 days. Marcus didn't try to stop them. He just logged their departures and adjusted the ration schedule to account for the lower population. 12 of us remained. Surrounded by the infrastructure meant for hundreds, living in the spaces between survival and complicity, waiting for Garrett to return and tell us what to think about the bodies we'd found. He came back on the 9th day. Walked into the vault like he'd just been on a routine supply run, set down his pack, and asked Marcus if there'd been any issues. Marcus told him about the bodies, about the people who'd left, about the settlement fracturing under the weight of what we'd found. Garrett listened without expression, then nodded once. "Where are they now?" he asked. "The ones who left?" "They didn't say." "And the ones who stayed?" "Waiting to hear what you have to say about those bodies." Garrett looked around the empty cafeteria, counting the absent faces, calculating. Then he looked at me. "You knew," he said, same words Iris had used, same flat certainty. "I suspected. And you stayed anyway." It wasn't a question, but I answered it. I stayed. He smiled then, and it was the first genuine expression I'd seen from him in weeks. "Then you understand." "Understand what?" "That we're down to the people who've decided survival matters more than morality, that everyone who couldn't live with that has already left. That what remains is a settlement of people who've chosen to be exactly what we need to be to keep going." He turned to Marcus. "The settlement to the west is real. 40 people, good infrastructure, established trade routes. They're looking to expand their network, and they're willing to offer supplies in exchange for labor and technical expertise." "And what do you think?" Marcus asked. "I think we send a delegation, establish contact, see if what they're offering is worth what they'll want in exchange." He paused. And I think we make sure that delegation consists of people who understand how to keep necessary secrets. Marcus nodded. So did the others who remained. People who'd learned the same lessons I had. People who'd made the same choices. People who'd become the same thing. I nodded too. Because that's what you do when you've run the numbers and understood the cost. When you've seen the bodies and chosen to look away. When you've become so complicit in the system that leaving it would mean admitting what you'd allowed yourself to become. You nod. You do the work. You make yourself useful. You survive. And you stop counting the cost, because if you started counting, you'd never be able to stop, and the weight of it would crush you under the certainty that everything you'd done to stay alive had killed the parts of you that made survival worth it. 3 weeks later, we made contact with the Western settlement. They were exactly what Garrett had described. Organized, efficient, focused on sustainable growth through calculated cooperation. They welcomed our delegation, offered us resources, invited us to join their network. And when their leader, a woman named Chen with sharp eyes and a voice that commanded without raising, asked us about our settlement's population, Garrett told her we were 12, growing slowly, looking to expand through careful recruitment. She smiled and said that sounded promising. That they valued communities that understood sustainable growth. That prioritized efficiency over sentiment. I understood then that we hadn't found a different kind of settlement. We'd found the same system, scaled larger, operating with the same logic, run by people who'd made the same choices we had. And I understood that this was what remained now. Not settlements of survivors trying to rebuild, but networks of efficient systems, each one perpetuating itself by removing variables that threatened stability. Each one run by people who'd learned to stop caring about the why and focus only on the what. Garrett had been right. Someone had to make the hard calls. Someone had to manage the resources. Someone had to decide who stayed and who became a problem that solved itself. And we'd all chosen to let that someone be someone else, as long as we benefited from the choices they made. I don't filter water anymore. I manage logistics for the trade network now, coordinating supply exchanges between settlements, tracking population shifts, identifying communities that are growing unstable or consuming more than they produce. It's detailed work, important work, work that keeps the network functioning, work that makes me essential. And sometimes, late at night in quarters that used to belong to someone else, I think about the highway overpass where I met Garrett, about the choice I made to trust him, about how that single moment of desperate hope had led me through every compromise that followed, each one smaller than the last, each one easier to justify, until I'd become the very thing I'd thought I was running from. But I don't think about it too often, because thinking about it doesn't change anything, doesn't bring back the people who've been managed out of the equation, doesn't rebuild the parts of myself I've traded away for continued survival. It just makes the work harder. And the work is all that matters now. The work, and the understanding that this is what it costs to keep going. That every system built on survival eventually learns to eat itself. That every person who lasts long enough becomes the thing they feared. That trust was always a liability I couldn't afford. And that recognizing it was a liability is what finally made me useful enough to last.